You're listening to Beyond the Sermon, the podcast of First Methodist Church in Collingswood, New Jersey. On our podcast, the goal is not just to share our sermons, but to go beyond the sermon and talk about what we're learning and what God is doing in us and in our community. The sermon you're about to listen to comes from our Fall 2023 sermon series, In the Wilderness. In this series, we're walking with the Israelites from Mt Sinai to the Promised Land and looking at what we can learn about trusting God more, even when the journey looks different than we anticipated or expected. You can find more information about our church at fumccollingswood.org. Thanks for listening. You ever feel frustrated? We all feel frustrated at some point, right? At different points. And there are different things that cause us to feel frustration, right? I want you to think for just a moment about some of those things that make you frustrated. Could be getting cut off in traffic. It could be your kids not listening to you anymore. It could be your brother or sister doing something repeatedly to annoy you. It could be worshiping in a 100-year-old church building with all the challenges that come with that. You get the idea, and you know those things that frustrate you, right? My son is currently frustrated with me at the moment because I forgot to dismiss the children. So, kids, you guys can head with Miss Hannah and Miss Mary Emily. Any kids up to age or grade 5, you're welcome to head on. There are frustrations that come in life, right? Frustrations that come from circumstances, from people. But there's a certain kind of frustration we feel when we're hungry, right? We call that being hangry. You know? And when we are thirsty, it's another thing entirely. Have you ever been really, truly thirsty? It's not an experience that we're too familiar with here in America, where we've got, Wawa on every corner and water fountains and sinks all over the place. But maybe you've been on a hike or something and you've not brought enough water. You've gotten truly thirsty. You can talk to Jeremy and Rebecca after the service about that if you don't know what that's like. Add that to the podcast list, Jeremy. But being thirsty like that, it's not a pleasant experience. Right? You start to feel deflated and your patience wears thin, and it's easy to begin to complain. And when the Israelites reached a place like that in their wilderness wandering, where there was no water, they got thirsty. And they got frustrated. The story this morning finds the Israelites some months after they rebelled against God by refusing to enter into the Promised Land. Numbers 20 tells us it was in the first month, presumably of the third year since they left Egypt. And just as God had said, the generation that came out of Egypt, the generation that refused to enter into the Promised Land, they began to die. Right? This is seen most notably in the death of Miriam, Moses and Aaron's own sister. If you go back in your Bible story memory, she was the one, right, who watched over Moses as he floated in the basket in the Nile River to escape being killed. But in the people's frustration over their thirst, they began to long for life in Egypt again. And they started to grumble against Moses. Not against God, but against Moses. And they asked Moses why he had brought them out into the desert. Well, maybe more than asking him why, they were accusing him. They were accusing him of bringing them out to the desert to die. Some of them even felt that it would have been better if they had died with the rebels at Kadesh, right? Numbers 14 tells us how those 10 spies who led the people to rebel against God's plan died there at Kadesh. And some of the people now felt like it would have been better for them to die there with them. And I think this is something that we often do in the midst of our frustrations, right? Rather than taking the time to think through what it is that we're actually frustrated about. And because let's be honest, right? Frustration is really just a form of anger, right? When we feel frustrated, we're angry about something. And anger is often used to mask some other kind of emotion that we're feeling, that we don't want to feel or that we don't want to deal with or process. Anger is a more acceptable emotion to display, especially in today's climate, right? Everywhere you look, somebody's angry about something. But we don't take time to think through what is happening underneath our frustration. Nor do we like to consider our own role in a given situation that has led to our frustration. And so we end up taking our frustration out on those close to us, or on some leader that we can point to who we can blame for the decisions that got us there, the people, leaders who are easier to point to. Anyway, the people were grumbling against Moses. And so Moses and Aaron, they go to the Lord on behalf of the people again, and God shows up for them. Right? He speaks to them, and he gives them a solution to the crisis that they were facing. God tells them to gather the people, speak to the rock, and water will come out so the people can drink. That sounds simple enough, right? It's not a big ask. Gather the people, speak to the rock. 1, 2. Even I can remember 2 things when I get sent to the grocery store. If it's 3, I need a list. But 2 I can do, right? Gather the people, speak to the rock. It sounds simple. Unless you've been in a very similar situation in the past. Remember when we were talking about Leviticus a few weeks ago, everybody's favorite Old Testament book of the Bible. We were talking about Leviticus. I told you how Leviticus was right there in the middle of the Torah and how the books on either side ran in parallel. And so Genesis and Deuteronomy, there's parallels there, they're bookends. And then Numbers and Exodus on either side of Leviticus. There are some parallels there, parallels that are important to pay attention to. So I want us to take out our Bibles, if you have them with you. And we're going to turn to Exodus chapter 17. I want to read you the story that's there. Exodus chapter 17, beginning in verse 1. The whole Israelite community set out from the desert of Sin, traveling from place to place as the Lord commanded. And it says Sin there. We hear Sin and we think things that had nothing to do with that. That was just the name of the desert. The desert of Sin. Traveling from place to place as the Lord commanded. They camped at Rephidim, but there was no water for the people to drink. So they quarreled with Moses and said, "Give us water to drink." Moses replied, "Why do you quarrel with me? And why do you put the Lord to the test?" But the people were thirsty for water there, and they grumbled against Moses. They said, "Why did you bring us up out of Egypt to make us and our children and our livestock die of thirst?" Then Moses cried out to the Lord, "What am I to do with these people? They're almost ready to stone me." The Lord answered Moses, "Go out in front of the people, take with you some of the elders of Israel, and stand and take in your hand the staff with which you struck the Nile, and go. I will stand there before you by the rock at Horeb. Strike the rock, and water will come out of it for the people to drink." So Moses did this in the sight of the elders of Israel, and he called the place Massah and Meribah, because the Israelites quarreled and because they tested the Lord, saying, "Is the Lord among us or not?" Sounds pretty familiar, doesn't it? Sounds a lot like that story that Jeremy read for us just a few moments ago. But this story here in Exodus 17 happens before the Israelites ever made it to Mount Sinai, right? But they had reached a place where there was no water. And so they grumbled against Moses. Moses goes to God, and God tells Moses to take the elders of the people and strike the rock, and the water would come out for the people to drink. Right? It sounds very similar. So the first time this happens here in Exodus 17, God told Moses to take his staff. Remember that staff? That staff that had become the symbol of God's redemptive power for Israel. God told him to take that staff and strike the rock. But then in Numbers, there's a difference. A couple differences, right? One, Moses is supposed to do it in front of the whole assembly of the people this time, to gather all of Israel, instead of just the elders. I think God was wanting to reaffirm the people's faith in Moses as their leader. But the second difference, the even bigger difference, is that instead of striking the rock with his staff, this time Moses was to speak to the rock, and the water would flow for the people to drink. But here in Numbers, the people aren't the only ones who are frustrated in this story, right? Moses is frustrated too. And can you blame him? I mean, Moses had been content, right? Hiding out in the wilderness, shepherding his father-in-law's flocks, and God appears to him. And he says, "You're going to shepherd my people out of Egypt, through the wilderness and into the promised land." But at every turn, those people that God called Moses to rescue were grumbling, or they were challenging Moses' leadership, or they were rebelling against God. And each time Moses intercedes on their behalf. He stands as the mediator between God and the people. This time, when Moses goes before the people after seeking guidance from God, God had told him, "Speak to the rock, and water would pour out." Now, I don't know if Moses' frustration just got the better of him that day, or if after all this mediating on behalf of the people, Moses is feeling a little self-righteous, or maybe a little big for his britches. But instead of speaking to the rock, Moses speaks to the people. And I want you to listen to what Moses says. Verse 10 of Numbers chapter 20. He says, "Listen, you rebels." Can you hear the frustration in his voice? "Listen, you rebels. Must we bring you water out of this rock?" Moses is frustrated with the people, and he's frustrated with their grumbling. He calls the people rebels, and then he takes responsibility for bringing the water out of the rock. And instead of speaking to the rock like God had told him to, he takes that staff and he hits it twice. Right? And the water comes pouring forth for the people and their animals to drink. Yay! Another successful miracle, right? Maybe not quite. Maybe not quite, because now it's God's turn to be frustrated. Now God, because of who he is, he still provided water for the people when Moses struck the rock again. But this choice that Moses makes right here, this choice not to obey God, this choice not to trust God, this choice not to honor God in the midst of the Israelites, this choice is why Moses wasn't allowed to lead the people into the promised land. I mean, it would be easy to say in this situation, what's the big deal? God told Moses to hit the rock the first time, so he hit it the second time. Water still came out, the people still drank. Can't we just move on? And I wonder if Moses had done that without seeking God's guidance, I wonder if God would have been quite so frustrated. But Moses did go to God. And he spoke to God. And God spoke to him and gave him instructions. He gave him the plan. God told Moses to speak to the rock. But Moses gave in to his frustration. He ignored God. And he did what worked last time. And I think that's the rub. You see, Yahweh had revealed himself to Moses and the Israelites as a completely different kind of God than the gods who were worshipped by the other pagan nations all around them. Where in those pagan religions, the goal was to figure out what rituals worked to accomplish what you wanted. And then keep doing that to get what you desire. The magic rituals that they would do were in an attempt to manipulate the supernatural powers to do your bidding. But Yahweh had shown himself to be a God who desired to walk with his people. He wanted to be in relationship with them. We see that in the covenant that he formed with them. We see it in the way he was guiding them by that pillar of cloud and fire. We see it in his desire to empower his people to live out and reflect his character before the nations around them. But being in a relationship doesn't look like empty ritual. It looks like walking with God, doing what he asks us in each situation. But Moses allowed his frustration with the people to outweigh the word of God to him. And his short-sighted reaction cost him the promised land, the ultimate goal that they were working towards. And when we allow our frustration with other people, with circumstances, with things beyond our control, when we allow that frustration to cloud our vision, we too become short-sighted. And it often costs us more than we can see in the moment. God understood that Moses and the people were frustrated by the circumstances that they found themselves in. God himself gets frustrated with them too, but the invitation was to trust him in the midst of those frustrations, to walk with him so closely that if he says, hit the rock, we're going to hit the rock. And if he says, speak to the rock, then we're going to speak to the rock. It's about trusting God himself rather than trusting in what has worked for us in the past. It's not about figuring out what works to get us what we want. It's about learning to walk with God. It's about learning to trust him, even when we find ourselves frustrated by other people, by circumstances, or by God not showing up when and how we want him to show up. He wants to walk with us. He wants to be in relationship with him. And as we prepare to meet with Christ at his table this morning, it's not just an empty ritual that we do in order to make God happy, or in order to do something, to get God to do something for us. As we prepare to meet with Christ at his table this morning, I want you to hear these words that Paul wrote to the church in Corinth in 1 Corinthians chapter 10, beginning in verse 1. He says, I do not want you to be ignorant of the fact, brothers and sisters, that our ancestors were all under the cloud and that they all passed through the sea. They were all baptized into Moses in the cloud and in the sea. They all ate the same spiritual food and drank the same spiritual drink, for they drank from the spiritual rock that accompanied them. And that rock was Christ. As Paul reflected on this episode in Israel's history, he looked back through the lens of Jesus and identified that rock that they drank from as Christ, the one who gave them the water which preserved their life in the midst of the wilderness. It was Christ providing for them even then. It was Christ, the one who said that if we would believe in him, streams of living water would flow out of our hearts to a dry and thirsty world. And so as we come to the Lord's table this morning, again, we don't come to do an empty ritual. We come to meet with God, to receive his grace, to allow him to transform us further and further so that we can be the kind of people that he can pour himself through to a world that needs him.